All right, gang, here we go. So we're going to work some more on lesson 17, and we're going to today tackle the conclusion of part 1 of the Augsburg Confession. We've got to the end. This is where we wanted to get. And then we're going to do this, and then I'm going to do a little quick overview of all the rest of the Augsburg Confession, which we'll do really quickly, but I want to spend a little time on the conclusion. So for your homework for today, I had you take a look at both the German translation and the Latin translation of or the English translation of the German, English translation of the Latin of the conclusion. And I wanted you to see if there were any differences. So what'd you find out? Were there any differences?
Yes.
Oh, there were. Yes, indeed. All right. So everybody's got some. So I want you each to be able to tell me one difference you found, and we'll only one, because I don't want you to take everybody else's. I think we can probably everybody have a different one. We'll see how it goes.
Okay.
We'll start with the oldest and go down. So Jude, you're dead last. Oh no, you have to work hard at it, buddy. All right, Oliver.
The only problem is they're sort of related.
Go ahead, just tell me you're one.
It's really difficult.
So Oliver means that he sort of wrote them all in one paragraph.
Oh, Oliver wrote.
I wrote a short paragraph about them both.
Oh, I see.
Really the same
well, see if you can just pull it apart and tell me one. But
Okay.
you go ahead and read your paragraph, and then if somebody overlaps, they can have that one since you're taking two. Go ahead.
I think I'll be able to make one. Whatever.
Okay.
2 sentences are missing, and I'm only going to read you one of them. For we certainly wish neither to expose our own souls and consciences to grave danger before God by misusing the divine name or word, nor to pass on or bequeath our children and descendants any other teaching than that which accords with the pure word of God and the Christian truth. It is missing from the Latin side.
All right. So the Latin it does not have the part about the clear teaching according with the truth, and that whole sentence is missing. Okay.
The second missing sentence shows that the confession should not be changed so the coming generation can have our same truths.
All right. So there's a special emphasis in the German text on the need to make sure that the next generation is hearing truth. Quite right. That's not mentioned in the Latin text. All right. Good. Titus, you're up.
Okay. I'm gonna read one and then go back and read and let everyone else read theirs because I have something to say about both of them together.
Okay.
The German says why this Augsburg Confession is preached. For the proper Christian instruction and for the comfort of consciences.
All right. So for the comfort of consciences and the proper instruction. Great. All right. Hadley. And that's not in the Latin.
Yeah.
That's not mentioned. You're quite right. So the comfort of consciences is a big deal. Good point. Okay, Hadley.
It seemed to me that the Latin seemed more short to the point and talked about just one plain thing. But the German, it seemed more longer, more eloquent. It wanted to fit more things into that same one.
Yes. Overall, the difference is the German is longer and it may be a bit more eloquent. The Latin is a little bit more terse and to the point. Okay, well said. Jude, you're up.
The Latin, the German says that the people, contrary to Lutherans, judge contrary to all Christians' unity and love. And the German, the Latin does not have that.
All right, so we have another example that the German is saying, hey, you guys aren't treating us right. You're treating us contrary to all Christian love. It's not nice. And the Latin doesn't say that. Now, you're quite right. In all these situations, the German is a little fuller and quite longer, and there are probably reasons for that. So now tell me all the other things you wanted to tell me about. Jude.
I have 2 more. The Latin says that the abuses were corrected for the sake of consciences. The German does not. And the German side talks about using God's name correctly, like one of the doers already said. And my conclusion is the German side, as usual, is more harsher because the people that is written for are unrefined peasants who are used to simple language.
All right, so maybe that's true. So it's written for simple use, but it's also written without the emperor listening in, because this happened a little bit later. So don't have to worry about offending him or anybody else. So that's part of what's going on here. All right, Hadley.
I have to say that it talks about not using God's name in a bad way.
and the Latin talks just about not abusing the church.
All right, so we have the adding more about God's name being rightly used. Good, Titus.
Okay, the German says why they started a Reformation, so they do not expose theirs and everyone else's consciences, souls to grave danger. These facts lead to this truth. Melanchthon is being persuasive. He's not going to say to the Pope, "You are in danger." He is blunt in the German. The Lutherans want to put themselves in the good graces of the Pope so they can continue the conversation.
All right, good. So the idea is that we are wanting to continue the conversation, and that definitely comes through in the German text nicely. Good. All right, Oliver.
The first sentence shows why the confession was written, and the first sentence shows why the confession was written. That sentence is, this is nearly a complete summary of what is preached and taught in our churches for proper Christian instruction in the comfort of consciences, as well for the improvement of believers. And it is missing from the Latin side, like Titus said.
All right, well done. Good job, guys. You're becoming good readers of texts and paying close attention. All right, so let's make sure we see what's going on here. What's the general gist? What's the point of the conclusion? What are they trying to do here? Hadley?
They're trying to say that the church should not be abused.
Correct, that the church should not be abused, and the Lutheran churches are being abused because the free teaching is not being given the chance to being taught. Okay, that's good. Jude and Titus?
Part one is being the part one of the Augsburg Confession is being backed up already.
Yeah, so it's already stopping and backing up part one of the Augsburg Confession. Good, Titus?
It could be for like someone who doesn't want to read the whole thing, but they just kind of want to skim by and see what these Lutherans are all about. This is the thing they should read.
This is a good thing for someone to say, hey, what's really going on here? What are they teaching? And that's how Melanchthon is trying to present this. All right, excellent. Now remember, the first 21 articles of the Augsburg Confession are pretty much just saying, here's what we believe. Here's the overall picture. And that's why we spent so much time going through every single one of them and looking at them. And we've done that. And now this is the conclusion of part one. So part one is really sort of the presentation of the key doctrine of the Christian faith. That's what part one is. Part two is what's going to start next, and that's going to be only the last 7 articles, and they're going to zero in on the specific things that are not going right in the churches at that time. So they're much more historical in nature, and they're a little bit more, this is a problem, and we had to do something about it. And so they're kind of giving an explanation for why that happened. But part one is the basic doctrine. So that's why we spent so much time thinking about part one, and that's why Melanchthon says, all right, this is everything we teach. This is the basic doctrine of the church, and here's why it matters. And then in a minute, I'm going to tell you about some other issues that are going on, which probably were the ones that were really causing the most problems and the people wanted to talk the most about were all these other issues at the time. But for us, what's most important now is part one, because that gives us the basic teaching of the church. Okay?
Yep.
So let's summarize. Let's go to our worksheet here. And so I want you to notice, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Oliver.
Would you say that is part two was more important for the Christians and the Lutherans back then, and part one is more important for us now?
Yeah, I would be willing to say that. I think that's not a bad way to put it, that part one probably matters more to us now than it did to them back then. But part two is probably the more interesting one for most readers back then. That's probably true. Now, part one always mattered because it's talking about basic teachings, but part two had a lot of people paying attention because they wanted to know about these specific things that were going on. Hadley?
So, but for the other people, the people who were on the other side of their argument on these issues, they just saw this as just kind of like just a letter which they wrote their things down, not really as much even as important as we think about it now.
Well, yeah, nowadays it's not as important because 500 years have gone by. But for them, it mattered a lot. Both parts mattered, right? Okay, good. So now let's make sure we get this all wrapped up here in a nice, neat, clean way. So the conclusion of part one on study sheet 7, I've got, notice 2 big reasons why all of this doctrine matters. And so what do you think? What are 2 big reasons that are offered why all this doctrine matters? What do you think? Hadley?
Why all this doctrine matters, it tells us just the doctrine of the Lutheran Church. But it also does teach us that it was the same back then and it has not changed.
All right, so there's a continuity here. That's quite right, and nothing has changed, and that's very comforting. In the conclusion that you read, what are the reasons that that Melanchthon is especially giving why this stuff matters? What do you think, Titus?
It says not to expose their souls and everyone else's to grave danger before God.
All right, that's going to be the second reason I want to emphasize. They're doing it for the sake of comfort and to protect their souls. What does that mean?
It means that the way the Roman Catholics are doing it, like works righteousness, it's not very comforting to know that do I have enough works done? Will God actually love me? They're doing it for the comfort of souls, the comfort of consciences. So your conscience can know, yes, I am forgiven, and yes, I don't have to do enough works to earn God's favor. It's also to protect their souls, because a lot of Roman Catholics back in that day were getting very messed up, and if they went any further, they might not even be called Christians.
All right, so we have this the problem is if you have the false teaching of thinking you have to earn your salvation, right, that endangers your soul, and it also takes away your comfort. There's no comfort in thinking I have to earn my salvation. And then your conscience, he talks a lot in here about conscience. That's the part of you that thinks, am I good enough? And I don't think I am good enough. I feel guilty. And you see, if you're always thinking you have to earn God's favor and you always feel like you're falling short, your conscience starts to bother you and you start to feel really bad. And so the whole point of good teaching is to bring comfort and to give consciences peace and to protect people's souls for eternal life. And that's what's at stake here. It's the difference between heaven and hell, and it's the difference between having salvation or not. So there's a lot hanging on this. It's not just that we're fighting over ideas. It's not just we're fighting about how to say something or how to have a worship service. We're talking about people's eternal life, and eternity hangs in the balance. It's a big deal, okay? So that's one key thing, and I don't want you to ever miss this, because this is why doctrine matters. When people say, doctrine's just ideas, why do we argue about all these ideas? They're just, old ideas. No, they're not just thoughts or ideas. These are things that matter for how we understand reality and how we live our lives. And so we live rightly with God. Okay, good. So what's the other reason that is offered here is very important of why we need to make sure that this teaching is quite rightly taught. Yeah, Oliver, what do you think?
So that when our children come and read it, and our grandchildren come and read it, and our great-great-grandchildren and our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren come and read it, they don't get the wrong stuff. And they'll read it correctly instead of getting the wrong stuff and saying, oh, this is how we do it, and then teaching a ton of people the wrong way.
Exactly. It's for the instruction of children. It's a big deal. And so you're right. So your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren. And so we make sure we keep them being taught well. Somebody has said, and I think this is a kind of a dramatic thing to say, but it's true, that Christianity is only one generation away from extinction. So that means that if one generation becomes unfaithful, then what happens to everybody after them? They're lost as well. And so that's why it's very important to make sure that each generation is learning well what it needs to learn so that the next generation can learn, and then the next generation. And so here we are 500 years after Melanchthon and Luther, and we're still paying close attention to their teaching and making sure we get it right. And why I'm spending time teaching you to make sure you get it right so that you can teach your kids someday the right way to understand these things and keep on being faithful. That's what is going on here. So the instruction of children and the comfort of their souls. And these things are related, because if we don't have right instruction and children aren't learning it, then consciences in the future won't have any comfort either. And they won't know the truth. And then people will be lost and not have God's gifts because they won't know about God's gifts. So all of this matters very much. That's kind of the big deal. All right. Also in point one, then, there's a special concern for what is taught to Children, and that's your blank to fill in. So it's the instruction of everybody, but especially children. And we've already talked about why that's so important, because every generation needs to learn or it all gets lost. And we can't let that happen. And that's the great concern here. All right. And then the second question, point I have here is about the comfort of souls. How does right teaching about God accomplish giving people comfort and make their consciences have peace? How does right teaching do that? Jude, what do you think?
God gives salvation no matter what you do. Well, as long as you trust in Jesus as your Savior.
All right. So the salvation comes when you trust Jesus. Oliver, add on to that.
Because if you have the correct teaching, you're going to have the correct truth. And the correct truth is, God says, whatever you do, I will forgive you, but do this how I want to, because this is the law that I tell you. And if you do that, then you'll have the comfort of souls. So
Right.
keeping the truth and the correct teaching is very important.
It is. We have comfort because God's truth reminds us of what he has done for us, what he's accomplished for us. So now we have the gift of salvation. We don't have to fight for it or earn it or make it happen ourselves, which never works. Always leaves us wondering, always leaves us afraid. But now we have comfort because the right teaching of the gospel gives people comfort. That's the whole point. Excellent. Very good. All right. So do the reformers think that they are creating new teachings or changing doctrine?
No, they're not creating new things, because that's what the past guys were saying. But they are changing the doctrine from this present era of this era where everyone was believing works righteousness to what the people earlier before them were thinking.
All right. So they're changing from the misuse of doctrine and the misunderstanding of it and bringing it back to what was true. Good, Oliver?
And what they're doing here is, instead of making a new teaching, and because there's only a few actual Christians back then, they're stabilizing it and actually showing that this is better than works righteousness or any of those other teachings. So they're trying to establish it firmer than making a new one. And the Roman Catholics actually made a new one. So they're the one that should have the abuses instead of the Lutherans.
Yeah, in fact, that's the point here. The new teaching is not what the Lutherans are doing. That's the ancient correct teaching of the church. The new teaching is what was introduced through all the years by the Roman Catholics. That's the point they're making. And it's kind of a, whoa, you mean we're the ones who are wrong? And the Lutherans are saying, right. And who's the right teaching? We're the ones who are teaching what the Bible, what Paul, and what Jesus actually taught. And that's the kind of the point. Hadley, do you have something else to add there?
Yeah, so you were talking about if this era doesn't learn, then the next world and stuff like that. So I was thinking, when Jesus had the flood, when God had the flood, did he do that because there's only a couple people in that era and just the world wouldn't do very well?
That's a great question. So why did God destroy the whole world back in Noah's time? And now we look at the world and we think it's pretty corrupt and pretty nasty, but why is he not sending a flood? And we're not sure why he did it one time, but not now. But what we do know is after the flood, God said, I'm making a promise, I'll never do that again. That's why I put the rainbow in the sky. And so he has given the promise that he's not going to wipe things out and start fresh. He's just going to bring everything to fulfillment. And part of the big reason is because Christ has now come. And so now that Christ has come, we're waiting for him to come again for the fulfillment of the eschaton and the fulfillment of his plan of redemption. And that's when everything will come back together as he's planned it. Until then, we just keep on waiting. But that's the difference. So there won't be any more floods or destruction until the last day. All right, Oliver?
So I think maybe, probably not, this reason why he to put the rainbow in the sky is because when he saw that he was killing creation, literally all that he had created, he was sad at what he did. So he put a rainbow in the sky and he said, I've made this promise, I'm going to stay with it till the end of time.
Yeah, and God is God and he's different than we are, and he doesn't feel bad about what he did or regret things, but we sometimes talk that way. And the idea that the rainbow is kind of a reminder for us about God's promise. And then it's a sense that God sees it and remembers all that he has promised us. And he always remembers what he's promised us. But yes, and the rainbow is a sign of comfort for us then of knowing that God always keeps his promises. That's what it means. Sometimes in our culture today, other groups have taken over the rainbow and use it for their own purposes. And that's kind of too bad and a little bit sad. But the rainbow is a great symbol of God's promises being kept. All right, go ahead and follow up, Titus.
Daddy said it was kind of like a bow shooting up to the sky.
Yes, that's exactly what it is. A bow shooting up to the sky. All right, Jude.
What other purposes was the rainbow used for?
No other purpose. It's just there for our benefit.
No, with the other religions.
I don't, oh, I mean, I was just mentioning not other religions. I'm talking about some groups that are socially active today think that the rainbow stands for everybody's way of life is good and nobody should be judged by people who think that they're living in a wrong way. And so lots of ideas are all good. And so everybody's got a right to believe what they want. Every truth is as good as another truth. That's sometimes what people think the rainbow means. Hadley.
Okay, so it's almost like God hung his bow in the sky, and he does it after every rain, because in every rain, it's almost like he's shooting down the raindrops with his bow, then he hangs it up afterward.
You can go with that. That's a good imagery. I like that. All right.
It's like a bow shooting into the sun's heart.
There you go.
Like the father son.
Oh, and then the rain is the blood from the sun because he shoots the arrow into the sun's heart.
All right, guys, we've taken our analogy far enough. All right. Now, last question on this front page of worksheet 17. We have a word for new doctrinal ideas. What's the word we have for new doctrinal ideas?
Religion.
No, it's a special word, and that word is, I've got it right here for you. It's heresy.
Oh.
Heresy.
So what does heresy mean?
Any new doctrinal ideas are going to be bad because the way back, as soon as Jesus ascended into heaven, the teaching was correct. That's
right.
what it should be. And so any new ideas added on or taken off are going to be wrong.
Okay, you're on the right track there. Oliver.
Noah's family might have been the only Christians left on earth.
Yeah, that's right. This is what the whole point of the scriptural story is, that they were the only people who were faithful left, and that's why God did that action. You're quite right. All right, what does this word heresy mean? You're right, it means any new idea is going to be problematic because it's going away from what we were actually given. But what does this word heresy actually mean? What is heresy? Yeah.
It's a teaching that is not Christian teaching.
A teaching that is not Christian teaching,
Or
right?
it's when someone teaches a non-Christian teaching.
All right, it's teaching that puts you outside of the church. It is so messed up, it is so wrong that you're not Christian anymore. And so that's what heresy is. It's not Christian. And so if a person is teaching heresy, they're not a Christian anymore. Heresy actually comes from a Greek word which means choice, hieresis. And so the idea here is that you have a choice to do what you want, and you have a choice to pick your religion, and that we call heresy, and that's a problem. All right, Titus?
Heretic is a person who teaches a heresy.
That's exactly right. A heretic is a person who teaches heresy. Good? Oliver?
Would you say the Roman Catholic Church is accused of heresy?
People accuse them of heresy, but we would say they are not heretical, but they are heterodox, which means a different kind of teaching than the truth. They're not quite right, but they're still Christian. And we would say the same thing about a lot of other Christians as well. Jude.
Heterodox, like directly from Greek, means different praise, different glory.
That's right. Other praise. We've talked about that before. Good job. All right. That wraps up page 1 of study 17. Let's now flip the page and get started on the next part. And that's the final 7 articles of the Augsburg Confession, which take up longer to write than the whole first part of the Augsburg Confession. All right, because the Augsburg Confession, part 1, you remember, started back at the very beginning, and part 1 began on page 37, and now we're on page 59, and we're all done. So that's 22 pages of both translations. So the next part starts on page 61, and it goes all the way to page 105. And so it's almost twice as long as the first part. All right. So Langton has a lot to say about this, and he's getting into this.
Wow.
So look on page 2 then of your worksheet, the final 7 articles. These final 7 articles all deal with very specific problems. That's the word you want to put into your blank there. Very specific problems that were happening at that time. And what time is this? It's 1530 when Melanchthon makes his presentation. Remember? Remember what day it was?
May something.
Not close.
June
Not May.
4th?
What?
May 4th.
No, it wasn't May.
June 4th?
It was June, but it wasn't June 4th.
June 17th?
June. I'll just give it to you since you're having a hard time remembering, I guess.
Sparkles.
What's that?
Sparkles.
Sparkles.
June 25th.
Oh.
June 25th, 1530. That was what we call the presentation of the Augsburg Confession. And that was the day when the Augsburg Confession was read out loud in front of Emperor Charles. And he heard the confession read, and the princes said, "This is our confession," and they made their commitment to that confession. Okay? So June 25th, 1530. So this is dealing with the problems that were happening at that time. So these are historical, and we might say local. Local means kind of for that one time and place. So these are historical and local in nature, things that mattered back then. Now, do they still matter to us today? Sure, and we can learn a lot from them. But as I said earlier, the issues weren't quite as pressing now as they were back then. And you'll see that when we start talking about them. Hadley.
So it's actually a good history lesson if you read them.
You're exactly right. It's a very good history lesson if you read them, but it's also a good lesson in doctrine because there's always doctrinal truths going on underneath. All right, so these all deal with very specific problems. I told you that was your first blank to fill in that were happening at that time. Since these are mostly historical issues, what role do they play for us? What do you think? Oliver?
They keep the truth going for generation and generation so the generation says Christianity is not to become extinct.
Good. And even though they're historical, there's always doctrine at work underneath there that we can learn from and pay attention to. Excellent. Good. So doctrine, my next 2 blanks, doctrine never changes, but the application of that doctrine does change. And so in other words, the doctrinal truth stays the same. God's truth is God's truth, but the application changes depending on the situation. So if you have somebody who is thinking they can earn their salvation by how hard they work and is trying, you're going to be emphasizing, no, this is all God's gift. Jesus did it all. Stop getting in the way of Jesus and his work. But if you have somebody who thinks, hey, Jesus paid for all my sins, I can live however I want and ask God for forgiveness and he'll just forgive me. And you're going to tell him, wait a minute, buddy, you got to be careful how you live. You can't just do anything you want. So you're going to say things that are both true, but you're going to say different things depending on the need. You understand what I'm getting at there? And so the situation is going to call for a different application. All right. You're going to say different things for different times. Even though the truth stays the same, you're going to emphasize different parts of the truth depending on the things that matter at that time. Okay?
Okay.
All right. So doctrine doesn't change, but the application does. So let's take a look at our quick overview. We've got a few minutes. Let's start into this. So we have the very first one is Article 22. All right. Article 22. And what's the title of this one? What's it called?
Concerning both kinds of sacrament.
The sacrament.
Concerning both kinds of the sacrament. And Latin just has concerning both kinds. So I've got the little chart for you to fill out. Every time we're going to ask the question, what's going on? And then we're going to ask the question, why does it matter? So let me just tell you what's going on a little bit. You can listen to this and write down what you think are the key points. So what was happening in the Middle Ages was that they had the understanding that when the priest said the words of institution, "This is my body," we've talked about this, remember, back when we did the Lord's Supper, they thought that Jesus' body became into the bread and the bread disappeared and it changed in its substance, remember?
What was that called again?
It's called
institution of the bread? What?
Transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation.
Transubstantiation. They had the idea of transubstantiation, that the bread was changed into the body and the blood was and the wine was changed into the blood. Well, they had the idea then that, well, if this is really Jesus' body, how do we need to treat it? Well, it's Jesus' body. And how long is it Jesus' body? Well, it's his body forever. And so people started getting some kind of crazy ideas. Sometimes people would go to the sacrament of Mass and they would get the bread in their hand, but instead of eating it, they would stick it in their pocket and take it home. And then they thought, now I've got Jesus in my pocket, I'm going to be protected. No one can bother me because I've got Jesus in my pocket. Or no demon can bother me, no sickness can get me because I've got Christ right here in my pocket. And so, yeah, people had those kinds of ideas. That was kind of a problem. Then they also have the problem of, well, what happens if like you drop a wafer on the floor? Oh, we just dropped Jesus' body. Quick, pick it up. And so that's why you have to be careful. But that's one thing. What happens if somebody spills some wine during the sacrament? What have you just done? You've just dumped Jesus' blood on the floor. Oh, no. And so this became one of the problems of, we can't let that happen. And so the idea of communion in one kind was an idea to say, we don't want to risk people taking the cup and drinking the wine because they might spill it. And so we'll just give them the bread and we'll let the priest be the one who drinks the wine. And so still to this day in the Catholic Church, most of the time when you go to a Catholic church, when they take communion, all you get is the bread. The priest is the only one who drinks the wine, and the people all get the bread. And they said, well, everybody knows that body, human flesh, always has blood in it a little bit. So just when you take the bread, you're also getting Christ's blood, and that's enough. So that's good enough. We don't need to do that. And so that was called having communion in one kind. In other words, one way, one form. So all they got was bread only. So what was going on was the people got bread, or the body, bread and body of Christ only, no cup. And by cup, I would mean the wine, the blood of Christ. They didn't get that. And they never had that. And to this day, sometimes if you go to a Catholic church, they'll even have this thing, when you take communion, when you're kneeling, a little boy who's called an altar boy, it could be you guys, someone your age, has this little dish on a stick, and he sticks it up underneath your chin, and he's there to catch any crumbs that might fall from your mouth when you take communion, so they can the crumbs of Jesus. Then they take that little plate, and they brush whatever crumbs are into the cup at the end, and the priest drinks all of it down, and then it's all gone. That's what they do. Oliver, you have a question? Oliver, did you have a question?
Yeah, it's not really a question, but someone sticks a piece of the bread in his pocket and the next day he gets sick.
Yeah, well, then they say, I guess I better take two pieces next time. And so they have their superstitions about this. Now, another thing that was going on at the time was they had this thing sometimes called a Corpus Christi processional.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah,
All right. We talked about that. That was when you would take the bread, which is now the body of Christ, and you would parade it around town to bring God's protection. And so that was called a Corpus Christi processional. And they said, no, we're not doing that either. But we're also going to make sure that from now on in our churches, we have both bread and wine, both the body and the blood. And who gets it? Everybody. And so we have, and that's having communion in both kinds. That's what it means. So why does it matter? It matters because Jesus said, take, eat, take, drink. He didn't say, take, eat, and the priest take, drink, and everybody else, you just watch him. No, he said, take, eat, and take, drink. And so that's why we say everybody should eat the bread and drink the wine and participate in the sacrament in both kinds. And that's why it matters, because we do it the way Christ told us to do it. And that gives us the comfort of knowing that we're being obedient to Christ and receiving all the gifts he has for us in the body and the blood and the bread and the wine. Okay?
Okay.
Good. Oliver, oh no, Hadley this time.
So if a man steals the bread, nobody gets communion that day.
Well, he would say he would rather have the bread in his pocket than having communion in his mouth. That was part of the problem, yes. And that was one of the reasons why they also started having the practice in the church a while back. And they wouldn't put it in your hand, they would put it right in your mouth. That way you couldn't take it home. And you would make sure you would swallow it because it was in your mouth. Okay?
You could do like this.
Yeah, I suppose you could. Titus.
It also is a way. If you don't drink the wine, it might make you feel a little bit not so much participating anymore. Like maybe the priest is. Sadly, last Sunday I didn't get any.
You didn't get any. Why?
I don't know. Why? I wasn't tilting it enough, I guess.
All right, you make sure you hang on to it longer and tilt it till you get some, Jude. It takes a little practice. All right. So, but yeah, you're right. You feel like you're not participating and you haven't received as much of, the fullness that Christ has for you. And that's quite right. So that's part of the reason why this matters. Okay, good. So that's the first one. That was Article 22. Article 23, let's just get started here. We'll see how the time goes. What's this one called?
Let's see, concerning the marriage of priests.
All right, concerning the marriage of priests. And so what was going on? What was going on was that the church had decided that because of what St. Paul says and what Jesus taught a few places, that to be single is better than being married. And they thought that a single life was superior to a married life, because if you were single, you could be more devoted to following Jesus and you could be more devoted to serving others, and you weren't distracted by being married. And there was also an issue at the time that sometimes people had some funny ideas about sexual things. And you'll learn more about that as you get older, about, husbands and wives and the things that go on there. And they thought that being married it's not as good as being single. You're more pure if you're single, and being married makes you a little less than what you should be. And so that was the idea they had, and it was a pretty strong idea. And they even got so strong on this idea that they made it a rule that if you were going to be a priest in the church, you could not be married. You had to be single, because you had to be pure and dedicated to Jesus, and you could not be distracted by marriage, and you could not be made impure by having, a life with sexuality as part of it. You had to stay away from those things and be pure, because they thought that was the better way to do things. And so this teaching was called celibacy. So celibacy is the idea, oops, I'll spell it right here for you. Celibacy is the idea that you can't be married and you can't be in love with someone of the opposite sex or be close to them. You need to be single and all by yourself. That's the idea of being celibate, okay? Get it right, yeah, celibacy. I'll spell it one more time, celibacy. All right, so their goal was that you would have to have sexually pure priests, and then the rule also applied to monks and to nuns. So if you were a monk or a nun, you had to be single, couldn't fall in love with anybody else or any other person. You had to be only devoted to Jesus and following him and devoted to the church and serving him. So that's what was going on. And then the reformers, Luther and Melanchthon and the other reformers, said, that's not what the Bible teaches. And that's it's imposing a burden on people that God doesn't expect. And it's making a rule where God has not made a rule. If somebody wants to stay single and they have the gift of being celibate, they don't want to be married, they don't need to be married, that's fine. But you can't make it a rule. And so that's why in the Lutheran church, they started saying, no, pastors can be married. So pastors can marry. Not all pastors do marry. Some pastors stay single, and that's okay too. But can they be married? Yes, they can. And in fact, one of the things that Luther taught very strongly was that marriage is not a bad thing, but a very good thing. And that is a good thing for people to be married and to have children and to be husbands and wives, and that pastors can also do that and still be pastors. So that's what this whole discussion was about on the marriage of priests, was the question of celibacy and forcing people to take a vow of celibacy, and whether that was the right teaching. And the Lutherans and the Reformers said, no, that's not the right teaching. We reject that teaching. Why does it matter? It matters because we want to make sure that we honor marriage and that we honor the idea that God has given this gift of marriage, and we don't want to impose a false rule on people that God has not made up. We're making up a rule that God has not given, and we're forcing that on people, and that's not the right way to live as Christ followers. Okay?
Okay.
Other questions about this one?
Why does it matter?
That why it matters is because we want to honor marriage. That's the first why it matters. And the second why it matters is we don't want to impose rules on people that God has not imposed. And when you start demanding a vow of celibacy, you're making a rule that God never made. And you're forcing that on people when God didn't do that. And that's not good. We call that a legalism, or trying to earn God's favor by doing more than God has commanded. All right, that's good. So that's the first two. That means we only have 5 left. I'm suspicious we'll get the next 5 done the next time we meet. And we'll figure out a time, because I'm going to be out of town the end of next week, but we'll find a time to do our last meeting then, okay?
Yeah.
All right, good guys. No homework. You can just enjoy the week, and we'll get together and do our last little wrap up, and we'll end the year then, probably our next session, okay?
Okay.
All right,
Sounds
guys.
good.
All right. Good for now. Let me get everything shut down here, and we'll see you guys later.